Welcome, dear listeners, to Whispers in the Dark, where shadows tell stories and the night breathes secrets. I'm your guide through the unknown, your storyteller in the silence, weaving tales that will haunt your thoughts long after the last word fades. Here, we embrace the eerie, the unsettling, the stories that lurk just beyond the edge of the firelight. So settle in, dim the lights, and listen closely. The darkness has something to say. So let's begin the spooky tale, Echoes of the Deep. The horizon was a marvel of modern engineering, a floating city sculpted from steel and glass and full of modern technology. Nearly 1,000 feet from bow to stern, the ship combined cutting-edge technology with sleek, luxurious design. Its hull, a shimmering silver blue, reflected the sun like a blade drawn across water, while solar-paneled wings along the upper decks absorbed sunlight to power its near-silent engines. The ship was designed to move with an eerie grace, so smooth it felt like drifting on still air rather than slicing through deep ocean. Inside, the horizon was a world of its own. Atriums filled with living greenery stretched skyward beneath massive skylights. Voice-activated suites adjusted light, temperature, and music with a whisper. Interactive glass walls displayed real-time ocean data, constellations overhead, or simply faded to clear to reveal the sea beyond. Restaurants hovered on transparent platforms over the lower decks, and infinity pools wrapped around observation lounges like ribbons of light. Even the corridors were softly lit and sound-dampened, designed to make every step feel like a calm breath. Despite its size, the ship exuded a strange kind of intimacy. Quiet corners, hidden gardens, and panoramic viewing domes invited guests to disconnect from the world. It was a masterpiece of innovation, a vessel built for elegance, adventure, and absolute control over nature's wildest frontier. With a low melodic horn that echoed across the harbor, the horizon slipped away from the dock like a ghost released from its tether. Sunlight danced on its sleek hull as the ship turned toward the open sea, cutting a clean path through the waves. Crowds on shore waved their farewells, growing smaller with each passing minute, until land itself faded into a distant blur. As the coastline vanished behind them and the sky stretched endlessly ahead, the horizon sailed into the vast unknown, its polished decks gleaming, its engines whisper quiet, and its course set firmly toward the deep. Among them was Amber and Matthew, young honeymooners, their hearts full of hope for the romantic trip ahead. The sea was calm, and the stars above shimmered like diamonds in the clear night sky. They stood at the railing, gazing out over the vast expanse of water.
Can you believe this is real?
Amber asked, her voice tinged with awe. She leaned closer to Matthew, her cheek brushing against his. Matthew smiled, squeezing her hand.
I can't think of anywhere I'd rather be.
The sun shimmered on the surface of the ocean like scattered diamonds, casting golden reflections across the deck of the horizon. Amber leaned against the polished railing, her auburn hair caught in the breeze, a soft smile playing on her lips. The endless blue stretched out before her, sky and sea melting into one seamless horizon. It felt like the edge of the world, peaceful and untouched. Beside her, Matthew sipped a cool drink and nudged her playfully with his shoulder.
Not bad for a honeymoon, huh?
He said, grinning. Amber laughed.
Not bad. This is paradise.
Every inch of the horizon gleamed with modern opulence. Gleaming glass elevators, infinity pools overlooking the waves, and quiet lounges that smelled faintly of sea salt and fresh citrus. They had spent the morning exploring the upper decks, stealing lazy glances at each other in the mirrored halls, and letting the luxury of it all sink in. There was something timeless about the sea, a slow rhythm that lulled them into ease. For the first time in weeks, after the chaos of wedding planning, travel arrangements, and goodbyes, they could finally breathe. Later that afternoon, they found a quiet spot near the stern, where the sounds of the engines were soft, and the wind carried only the faint calls of gulls trailing in the ship's wake. Amber rested her head on Matthew's shoulder, her fingers laced with his. They watched the sun begin its slow descent, painting the clouds in streaks of rose and gold. Neither of them noticed the faint shift in the breeze, nor the fog forming in the distance. The closer they got to the open ocean, the heavier the fog seemed to grow. It moved unnaturally fast, as though it had a life of its own, wrapping around the ship and dimming the bright lights that had once gleamed like stars in the darkness.
I don't like this.
Amber muttered, a knot forming in her stomach.
Matthew frowned and looked out over the water, his unease mounting. The fog had been rolling in fast, and with it came a sudden, unnatural silence. The usual creaks and groans of the ship's hull, the soft hum of the engines, everything had stopped. All they could hear was the sound of their own breathing. Suddenly, a deep, soul-chilling foghorn pierced the night. It wasn't the usual foghorn of the horizon. This was something darker, more mournful, like a warning from a time long past. The sound carried across the fog, reverberating through the ship, lingering in the air like an omen. The passengers froze, the eerie sound sending a wave of discomfort through them.
Did you hear that?
Matthew whispered, his voice barely audible. Amber nodded, her stomach twisting. Before they could speak further, the ship lurched forward with a sickening jolt, as if caught in the grip of something unseen. The deck beneath their feet groaned ominously. Passengers screamed, their voices rising in panic. The sound of rushing footsteps echoed through the corridors as the crew scrambled to regain control.
What's happening?
Amber gasped, grabbing onto Matthew as the ship seemed to shudder again. Matthew replied, his heart hammering in his chest.
We need to get inside. Fast.
But before they could retreat to the safety of the ship's interior, something in the fog caught Amber's eye. A shadow, vast and impossible, loomed in the distance, barely visible through the thickening mist. Amber had seen this ship before in photos and on television. Its shape was unmistakable. It was the Titanic. It was just a shadow at first, barely distinguishable from the fog. But the more they stared, the clearer it became. The dark shape of the ship was undeniable. A massive, looming form, its silhouette stark against the fog. It was as though the very past had risen from the sea to haunt the present. Amber was frozen, her eyes locked on the apparition. The fog parted slightly, and there it was, clear as day. The Titanic, only it wasn't right. The lights that should have been shining from the grand windows flickered weakly, casting an eerie glow over the ship. The towering figure of the doomed liner moved through the fog like a ghost, its rusted bulk towering over them like a judgment. But there were no passengers on deck, no signs of life, only a spectral presence, a ghostly ship. The foghorn sounded again, the same mournful, deafening cry that seemed to cut into their very souls. It was unmistakably from the Titanic. This was no hallucination. This was something else. Something old, something dark, something cursed. Suddenly, the air grew freezing. The temperature plummeted, as if the ship had sailed straight into the heart of winter. Every breath they took came out in visible puffs of white, and the world around them seemed to close in. The crew scrambled in panic, but the fog thickened so fast they could barely see the person standing next to them. The Titanic's bell rang once again, the sound resonating deep into their bones. It was a low, deathly toll, as though the ship itself was mourning, wailing for the lost souls that had perished with it. Then, in the blink of an eye, a blinding light shot through the fog, flickering like lightning. It was coming from the Titanic, not just a light, but something far worse. An immense pull, like a tidal wave of force, was growing stronger and stronger.
Amber, we have to move now.
Matthew shouted, trying to yank her toward the lifeboat deck, but his voice was drowned by the roaring sound that filled the air, the deep, rumbling sound of something breaking. The ship was groaning, creaking under the immense pressure, and then, with a horrible screech, it felt as though the very ship itself was pulling them toward the Titanic. No, Amber's heart pounded in her chest as she turned back toward the fog, her eyes wide with terror. The Titanic, now clearly visible and terrifying in its enormity, had grown closer. She could see the glowing, decayed windows, could see the blackness inside, and standing at the railing, staring out at them from within the fog, were shapes, people, but not people. Their faces were pale, like death, their eyes hollow and black. They seemed to be watching them. The ship tilted, and the sound of the engine sputtered as the horizon began to take on water. Amber could feel the deck beneath her feet shift, and before she could scream, the ship lurched violently to the side. The force of the movement threw her and Jake to the ground, crashing into the cold steel of the deck. She could hear people screaming as the ship's tilt became steeper, the water now rising fast around them. But all Amber could focus on was the Titanic, the cursed ship, the ship from the depths. It was coming, and it was not coming to save them. The ship was no longer in control. The horizon shuddered violently, its steel frame groaning under the immense weight of the pressure. The distant rumbling of the Titanic's engines mixed with the frantic noise from the panicked passengers above and below decks. Emily's body was thrown to the side, slamming into the cold steel of the railing, and she gasped, her breath coming out in visible puffs as the temperature continued to drop. The ship lurched again, this time at an even steeper angle, causing a violent ripple of screams to fill the air. Matthew called to Amber, but his voice was barely audible above the chaos. But she could feel his hand gripping hers as they scrambled to their feet. The fog had thickened even more, now almost suffocating. It was as though the air itself had been replaced by the cold breath of the abyss, a living, breathing force that was closing in on them. Amber and Matthew held each other, scared and panicked, as the foghorn from the Titanic rang out again, deafening and long, reverberating through the air with a sound so mournful it felt like it was dragging their very souls toward the past. It was as if the Titanic itself had risen from the depths to reclaim them. Amber's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She could feel the ship sinking beneath them, as though the water was rising faster now, like something was pulling it under. A voice shouted nearby, ordering everyone to the lifeboats. Amber turned to see the crew scrambling, shouting orders, their faces frantic. But the fog was now so thick that they were losing sight of each other, swallowed by the thick, impenetrable cloud. Matthew grabbed Amber's hand and pulled her toward the port side of the ship, toward the lifeboat station. But as they ran, their footsteps became unsteady, slipping on the wet deck. The ship was tilting sharply now, far too much for comfort. The water had begun to pour over the edges of the deck, swamping everything in its path. Suddenly, the ship lurched again, this time with such force that Amber was thrown to the ground. Her body slammed against the metal, and for a moment, the world spun around her. When her vision cleared, she saw the dark form of Matthew, clutching the railing, trying to pull himself up. His face was a mask of terror, his eyes wide as he looked behind them, toward the Titanic. Amber's heart skipped a beat as she followed his gaze. The Titanic had come closer, impossibly so. She could now see the massive hull in full, towering over them like an impossibly ancient beast that had risen from the depths. Its blackened, rusted sides gleamed in the pale, sickly moonlight. Its once proud hull now split and rusted, metal ribs exposed like the bones of a long-dead leviathan. Rotting lifeboats hung in tatters from corroded davits, and broken railings twisted upward like skeletal fingers grasping at the sky, while every shattered porthole stared blankly outward, as if still watching the moment time stood still beneath the sea. But it was the lights, those dim, flickering lights, that caught her attention. The ship was not empty. People, they were standing at the edges of the Titanic's decks, their faces pale and blank, staring at the horizon like ghosts. No, like something worse than ghosts. Their eyes were hollow, black, and lifeless. They moved in eerie unison, their bodies jerking and twitching unnaturally, as if the fog itself controlled them.
This can't be happening.
Amber whispered. Her words were lost in the rising chaos around her. The Titanic's foghorn blared again, this time louder, shaking the very foundation of the horizon. And as the ship's bell rang out, a sudden, sharp pain shot through Amber's chest, as if a part of her soul was being dragged toward the other ship. The moment felt endless, suspended in time, as if she were falling through an endless void. Then the ship groaned, a sickening sound that tore through the ship like a death rattle.
Oh, God! Matthew, we have to get off now!
Amber screamed. But it was too late. The fog seemed to come alive, swirling around them with a force that was like a tidal wave. It choked the air from their lungs, pulling at them, pushing them toward the edge of the ship. The Titanic loomed closer still, its ghostly presence engulfing the horizon. The two ships were almost touching now. The sheer size of the Titanic felt like it was suffocating them, like the very ocean was closing in on them. And then, out of the thick, oppressive fog, they heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, slow, deliberate, but not from the living. Matthew froze, his hand gripping Amber's tightly. He turned slowly, his face pale with terror as he met her eyes. A figure emerged from the fog, stepping onto the deck from the shadows. He was dressed in the uniform of a ship's officer, but it was old. The fabric of his coat was torn and faded, his face gaunt and hollow, a mere skeleton beneath the tattered remains of his uniform. His eyes were black, endless voids that stared through them, as though he could see into their very souls. His mouth hung open in a grotesque, silent scream, his hand outstretched toward them. Before they could react, more figures appeared, emerging from the fog like shadows, their movements jerky, unnatural. Each figure was dressed in the same tattered clothing, their faces just as hollow and lifeless. Some were human-shaped, while others had twisted features, broken, contorted, as though their bodies had been altered by the ocean's wrath. One by one, they moved toward Amber and Matthew, their footsteps silent on the soaked deck, like predators closing in on their prey. The officer's skeletal hand reached out, and Amber could feel the air grow colder still. Her heart thundered in her chest, and her legs felt weak, as if the very air was draining the strength from her body. Matthew tried to pull Amber back, but the officer's hand shot forward, grabbing Amber's wrist with an inhuman strength. The cold that radiated from the figure's touch made her scream in terror. And then, in a deafening crescendo, the horizon jerked again, throwing them both off their feet. The ship was sinking now, too fast, too violently. The lifeboats were still hundreds of yards away, and the deck had become a chaotic mess of people, all scrambling to escape. But the Titanic's ghostly presence had already begun to consume them. The deck was now flooded with water, and the icy sea threatened to swallow them whole.
Matthew cried, grabbing Amber's hand and pulling her toward the nearest railing.
But as he looked over the edge, the sight of the roiling black ocean below filled him with an overwhelming dread. Above them, the Titanic's ghostly figures were coming closer, dragging their feet with cold, unyielding determination. And then, with one final groan,
The horizon gave way.
the horizon was no longer a ship. It was a cage, trapped in an ocean of fog, swirling darkness and unearthly chill. It teetered precariously, its hull creaking and groaning like a living thing, desperate to keep itself afloat. The deck beneath Amber's feet was slick with seawater, and every step she took felt as if the ship might collapse under her. Around her, panicked passengers screamed in terror, some scrambling toward the lifeboats, others desperately clutching onto anything solid, as if trying to hold on to the world itself. But above the frantic noise, a deeper, more unsettling sound filled the air. The sound of the Titanic's bell, tolling with a hollow, mournful ring. It echoed across the fog, each chime sinking into their bones like a death sentence. The water around the horizon rose steadily, inching higher with each moment, as if the ocean itself had a hunger, an insatiable desire to drag them under. Amber's breath came in ragged gasps as she gripped the railing, her hands trembling. The icy grip of fear had seized her chest. The Titanic, the ghost ship, had already swallowed them whole, and now it was pulling them to their doom.
Matthew, we have to get out.
She shouted, her voice barely audible over the deafening chaos. Matthew was standing beside her, his face pale, eyes wide with terror. His hands were trembling as he clutched onto a rope, trying to steady himself against the violent pitch of the ship. The fog seemed to close in even tighter around them, the world narrowing until all they could see was the dark shape of the Titanic looming just beyond the ship's railing. The spectral figures on its decks were now visible in full, moving toward them like a slow, relentless tide of death. They came, one by one, their eyes black voids, their limbs jerking and twitching unnaturally, as if each of them were marionettes controlled by some unseen hand. They were coming closer, their tattered uniforms flapping in the wind, their faces twisted into expressions of agony and rage. These were not the kind of ghosts that floated through the air. No, these were tangible, solid, and they were coming for them. Amber's heart raced as she realized the truth. They weren't going to stop. With an ear-splitting crack, the ship lurched violently again, sending them both sprawling across the deck. The water was now ankle-deep, creeping steadily toward the bow. Amber scrambled to her feet, pulling Matthew along with her. But just as they managed to regain their balance, an unbearable cold pressure filled the air, like the ocean itself was squeezing them. A shadow passed overhead, something large and dark, moving impossibly fast across the fog. Amber's blood ran cold as she looked up. It was the Titanic again. But this time, it wasn't just an illusion. The ship had moved. Its massive silhouette blocked out the stars above, its towering bulk casting an impenetrable shadow over them. As the Titanic loomed closer, the fog parted with an unnatural swiftness, revealing the horror within. At the bow of the ghost ship stood the captain, or at least what had once been the captain. His figure was hunched, his face a nightmarish mass of decayed flesh and hollowed eyes. His lips were split in a grotesque grin, but there was no joy in it, only a deep, ancient anger that seemed to radiate from his very being. His hand, skeletal and gnarled, was raised toward them in a silent command. Amber's stomach churned with terror. Suddenly, the captain spoke. His voice was a low rasp, a sound that didn't seem to come from a mouth at all, but from somewhere deeper.
Join us in the depths.
Before Amber could react, the Titanic lurched again, this time with such force that the horizon seemed to tilt at an almost impossible angle. The water rushed in faster now, pouring over the sides, flooding the deck like a wave from the depths of the ocean itself. Passengers screamed in terror, but the sound was drowned out by the ship's death rattles and the endless, haunting toll of the bell. The fog thickened even more, and as Amber turned to grab Matthew's hand, she saw a figure emerge from the darkness. A figure draped in tattered clothing, moving unnaturally toward them. It was one of the lost souls from the Titanic, but this one was different. His face was more twisted, his eyes completely black, his mouth open in a silent scream. The air around them grew even colder, the fog thicker. The figure reached out a skeletal hand and touched Matthew's shoulder. The moment the figure touched him, his body convulsed violently. A terrible, unnatural scream tore through the air as Jake's bones seemed to crack under an invisible force. Amber screamed in horror, stumbling backward as the figure dragged Matthew forward. His body twisted, his joints snapping and contorting, his spine cracking like dry wood, until there was nothing left but a twisted, broken form. The figure tossed him aside like a rag doll. Amber's mind couldn't comprehend what she was seeing. It was as though reality itself had been bent, twisted into something unrecognizable. She dropped to her knees, helpless, her chest heaving as she tried to breathe, her cries drowned by the deafening, gut-wrenching crack of the ship's hull as it tore itself apart. Above her, the captain's hollow eyes glared down, his face twisted with malice as the fog grew thicker still, swallowing the ship whole. The Titanic had not only risen, it was now claiming them all, and Amber knew, in the pit of her heart, that she was next. Amber ran, slipping, stumbling, gasping for breath. She ran. The once glittering decks of the horizon had become a nightmarish labyrinth of warped metal, rushing seawater, and the cold breath of death. The ghostly glow of the Titanic loomed above her like a floating mausoleum, bathing everything in its sickly blue light. Its shape eclipsed the stars, its fog curling down, like fingers dragging her into the past. Every hallway, every stairwell she passed, was flooded, either with water or shadows she dared not look at too long. Behind her, the screams had ceased, the laughter had started. Low, guttural laughter, a chorus of it, coming from the fog, from the corridors, from below. It echoed across the drowning ship, as if 100 voices were mocking the last living heartbeat that dared to resist. Amber's bare feet slapped against the freezing metal floor as she descended deeper into the ship. She had no plan, just escape, survival. But with every turn she took, she realized the ship was no longer the horizon, not fully. It was changing. The walls bled rust, the carpets had rotted to mush beneath her. Portraits that once showed smiling families and sunlit vistas now revealed drowned faces, bloated and wide-eyed, mouths agape in silent screams. The very architecture was shifting, twisting, a blend of the horizon and the Titanic, stitched together by some malignant force beneath the ocean floor. Amber paused to catch her breath, leaning against a twisted bulkhead. Her fingers left streaks of blood on the metal. She hadn't realized her palm had split open. Everything hurt. Her muscles trembled with adrenaline and exhaustion. Her eyes stung from the salt, the cold, the terror. Then she heard it. Step, drag, step, drag. A figure limped toward her down the hallway. At first, she thought it might be a survivor, another passenger. But the way it moved, too slow, too broken. Its spine bent at the wrong angle. Its legs shambled without rhythm. Its arms dragged behind it, fingers blackened and split like drowned wood. It wore a Horizon crew uniform, and as it neared, She saw that its skin was a patchwork of sea rot and barnacles, its face torn open in a rictus grin, with eyes that had sunk so deep they no longer reflected light.
Come home.
It gurgled, water pouring from its mouth with every word. Amber screamed and bolted down the hall. Behind her, doors banged open. 1, 2, dozens. Footsteps, wet and uneven. They followed. The dead of the Titanic and the newly claimed crew of the Horizon now walked together, an army of the drowned. She burst through a heavy door that had once led to the Horizon's ballroom. It had been grand once. Chandeliers, polished floors, soft string music. But now the room was blackened, bloated with seawater. The floorboards had cracked open like ribs. The tables had been pushed aside to form a wide circle, and in its center stood the captain, not of the Horizon, but of the Titanic. He towered above the scene, his coat now fused with the flesh of his shoulders, as if he'd worn it for eternity. Seaweed coiled around his legs like shackles. His face was a mask of rot and bone. His eyes, twin holes of endless cold. He raised his arm, and silence fell. The dead circled Amber slowly, eyes glimmering with hunger, heads twitching to follow her every move.
You were warned.
Amber shook her head, backing away, feet slipping in the ankle-deep water. Suddenly, the floor gave way.
Water surged upward like a geyser, and Amber screamed as she was thrown into darkness, pulled down into the bows of the ship. She hit something hard, then water enveloped her, black and frigid, like liquid glass. It swallowed every sound, every breath.
Her limbs flailed, reaching for the surface that no longer existed. Shapes moved around her beneath the surface. Hands grabbed at her ankles. Faces pressed toward hers. They weren't trying to kill her. They were trying to bring her home, to the deep. With one final scream, one that only she could hear in the depths of her mind, Amber burst to the surface, gasping, crying, choking. She was no longer inside the ship. She was on the deck of the Titanic, or what remained of it. The real ship was gone, wrecked at the bottom of the Atlantic. But this one, this cursed echo, had found its way back, and now it wanted her. Amber staggered forward, barefoot on rusted steel, surrounded by the fog and the whispers of the dead. The cold pressed into her bones, numbing her thought. Then she saw them, all the passengers, all the crew, all the victims, standing silently, waiting, watching, and behind them, rising from the shadows, was something colossal, a shape, a mass, a towering figure of tangled bones, twisted steel, and writhing seaweed, the embodiment of every death claimed by the sea, a god of the drowned. It looked at her and smiled. The sea was no longer water. It was alive. It twisted and screamed beneath the dying light of a bruised sky, heaving and churning around the ghostly wreck of the Titanic and the broken shell of the Horizon. The fog had thickened to a black veil, blotting out the stars. No moon, no lights, just darkness and death. Amber stood trembling at the edge of the Titanic's rotting bow, her skin pale, lips blue, hair matted to her face by freezing salt water. Her eyes were wide and hollow. Behind her, the rows of the dead stood in absolute silence, hundreds of souls frozen in time, watching her final moments unfold. The towering mass, the leviathan of the deep, had fully risen from the ocean now. It was as if the sea had torn its own heart out and given it form. Its body was made of shipwrecks, corpses, and forgotten memories. Its face was a gaping maw of iron and bone, eyes glowing like dying stars. Each breath it took caused the tides to convulse. The sky itself seemed to bend around its form. There would be no survivors. Amber's scream was swallowed by the wind as the Titanic began to crack apart beneath her. The ship groaned, low, mournful, and final, like a whale's death cry. The deck split open along its center, as if gutted by some invisible blade. Ghosts tumbled into the chasm, vanishing into nothing. The fog flared white with lightning, revealing the horror in full. The horizon, completely capsized, hung half-submerged just beside them, riddled with ghostly figures clawing at the glass, trapped beneath the surface. The two ships, the lost and the living, were becoming one. Amber dropped to her knees. Her body shook, not from cold anymore, but from the weight of despair. There was no escape. The sea had made its judgment. From behind her came the captain's voice, ancient, cracking like splintered wood.
You walked into a grave. Now lie in it.
The deck beneath her feet snapped, and Amber fell into the ocean's maw. Water swallowed her whole. It was not the chaotic, bubbling chaos of drowning. It was still, silent, as though the sea wanted her to feel every moment of her descent. She sank slowly, arms spread, eyes open. Around her drifted the memories of those lost. A child's doll, a silver tray, a shattered violin. Faces stared from the depths, wide-eyed, mouths open in silent screams, preserved in some twisted echo of their final moments. Then the Leviathan descended. Like a god falling from the heavens, it plunged into the sea after her. Its mouth opened, a swirling void lined with jagged debris and teeth made of anchors and bones. Amber was weightless in the deep as it consumed everything. The Titanic, the horizon, the souls, the wreckage, all of it drawn into its impossible jaws. A vortex erupted, shaking the seafloor. The ocean turned black, and then silence. The fog lifted. The sea was calm once more. No ship, no wreckage, no bodies, just a perfectly still ocean, stretching into eternity, as if nothing had ever disturbed it. Months later, search teams scoured the Atlantic, baffled by the sudden disappearance of the luxury liner Horizon. No debris, no distress signal, no trace. Only one thing was ever recovered, a barnacle-encrusted lifebuoy, its faded letters barely legible beneath the salt and grime. Titanic. Thank you for listening to Whispers in the Dark. If you'd like to support the show, head over to our Patreon, where you can sign up to one of 3 different tiers. Or, if you'd prefer to make a one-off contribution, maybe you'd like to buy me a coffee, or show support through our website at Buzzsprout. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook and YouTube to stay up to date with new episodes, behind-the-scenes content, and more chilling tales. And remember, you've heard the whispers, but some doors once opened never truly close. If you feel something watching tonight, don't look back. We'll see you next time, if the dark lets you go.